Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. We are assembled for another COZ meeting, and we're delighted to have Malcolm Miller from London, Jehoash Hirshberg from Jerusalem, and there may be others with us as well to talk about Joseph Tal today, this little picture you see. Just before we start, Malcolm is going to talk a little bit about his uncle Joseph Horovitz, the well-known composer, British composer born in Vienna, his uncle, who sadly passed away at 95 last Wednesday. So,
Okay, first of all, I want to welcome everybody here for the session, which is about Joseph Tal. And as Geraldine Auerbach has just said, I would like to start with something to say about another Joseph, and that is Joseph Horovitz, who sadly passed away this week, last Wednesday, aged 95 in London. And as Joseph Horovitz was my uncle, and as well as being a wonderful musician and composer, I just thought it would be appropriate, as I've got many memories of him and his music, just to say a few words about him in tribute at this particular point. Am I right in thinking that we're being recorded? I'm not absolutely sure.
yes, we are.
YouTube and locally.
So what I would like to say is, literally in the last few days, there's been an obituary in the Daily Telegraph. There've been tributes on the radio, in Radio 3, various websites, Twitter, Facebook, and reading all the comments that people have said, what comes across is a simple but not always obvious truth. And that is that Joseph Horovitz composed music which audiences love to hear and which musicians love to play. And amongst my many childhood memories of my uncle, we called him Uncle Joe, about music making, of course, including private improvisations and performances at parties and the like. One of the outstanding things in my youth was to be able to go and watch my uncle conduct his own works at the Fairfield Halls, the Royal College of Music, or various other venues. And amongst the highlights was my attendance at the world premiere of his fifth string quartet, which was one of the most important works he wrote. It was played by the Amadeus String Quartet on the occasion of the 60th birthday of fellow Viennese emigre art historian Sir Ernst Gombrich. And it's a work which programmatically reflects on the family's experience of being Viennese refugees. So Joseph Horovitz, my uncle, was born in Vienna in 1926 to his parents Bela and Lotte Horowitz, and it happens today to be the yahrzeit of Bela Horowitz, who founded the Phaidon Press in 1923, developing it into a leading global art book publishing house, and he brought it over to England in the 30s, as I'll just say, and died in 1955 on this day. Joseph was the oldest of three siblings, brother to Ellie, my mother, who became an art publisher like her father, and to Hannah, who became a concert agent and impresario. And they left Vienna in just days after the Anschluss, through a perilous journey, the two children traveling on their own, Joseph and Ellie, and the baby Hannah coming soon afterwards. They settled in London, and Joseph studied at New College, Oxford, then at the Royal College of Music, and then with Nadia Boulanger, the famous teacher in Paris. After that, he held a number of conducting posts, produced award-winning ballets in the 1950s, and gradually developed what became his hallmark, a distinctive synthesis of jazz and classical styles. Which was first essayed in the Clarinet Concerto of 1957, and particularly in the Jazz Concerto for Piano or Harpsichord of 1965. And that work featured just this last summer in the BBC Proms 2021, in the season to celebrate his 95th birthday. And all in all, Joseph's oeuvre is impressive: 12 ballets, 2 chamber operas, a full-length opera based on the 1939 MGN movie Ninochka, concertos for various instruments, works for brass band and wind band, and of course his very famous and very popular Captain Noah and His Floating Zoo, a cantata for children written to a text by Michael Flanders, but I think for children for all ages is the subtitle. It received a splendid 50th anniversary performance by the BBC in 2018 under John Wilson. He was a much-loved teacher in the Royal College of Music since 1961, nearly 60 years. He was inspiring young musicians for an amazing 60 years. And John Wilson, who I just mentioned, was one of his students. And in fact, it was for John Wilson that my uncle was still working on parts for a performance of his violin concerto, an early work, which is due to happen in several months. And he was working right up to the end. And all the way through his life, he was, as well as being a composer, of course, he was a wonderful uncle, a family man. He was married to Anna, my aunt, and was blessed to pass on his wonderful joie de vivre and humor to his two daughters, my cousins, and their children and their grandchildren. And it was very symbolic very recently at the annual Hanukkah party that he lit on Zoom 8 candles for the entire 4 generations of the family. And the symbol of 8 in Judaism is that of completion, and it seemed to sum up the completeness of his life, a life that was very full and rich. Now, I hope that in the COZ series, it may be possible to find a moment to explore his work, but in the context of his Jewish works, as I would call them. And they number quite a few. He wrote a ghetto song for guitar from some incidental music to the play The Dibuk, and it's based on the Yiddish song Belts. He wrote probably the first work commissioned from any Jewish composer for the choir of St. Paul's Cathedral, Sing Unto the Lord a New Song in 1971. And he wrote another oratorio based on the Old Testament, apart from Captain Noah, and it's called Samson for voices and brass band. So that's for the future. But now I just want to end by saying that he did in fact meet Joseph Tal, maybe more than once, and he told me about his meeting with Joseph Tal. Of course, the two had very, very different styles, and he even told me that I think Joseph Tal was sort of somewhat, dubious about writing humorous music in the way that he did, but they formed a friendship and they were on very good terms. I think Hans Keller perhaps was a mutual friend. So that was the connection with today. And so now I'd like to move on to Tal, but thank you very much for allowing me a few minutes to remember Joseph Horovitz and the legacy that he left for everyone, his works and his inimitable personality that he passed on to generations of students and audiences. So I'm delighted now in talking about Tal to welcome our speakers this week. It is the eminent musicologist, Professor Jehoash Hirshberg, and the composer, artistic director, and educator, Michael Wolpe. And together with more colleagues, they're going to, over 2 weeks, discuss the works and the life and works of Joseph Tal. Just a few words about Jehoash Hirshberg, but many of you will know him. He is the Professor Emeritus at the Musicology Department of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he's chiefly known, particularly on this side of the globe, for his pioneering research into Israeli art music and its roots in what's called the Jewish community of Palestine before 1948. And that's the title of his groundbreaking book for OUP. Apart from numerous essays and articles that he's written, Professor Hirshberg also wrote the first monograph biography of Paul Ben Chaim, and most recently started an impressive series of books on Israeli composers. They've already brought out one on Yehezkel Brown, on Tzvi Avni, and I believe this is the next one in the series, but Professor Hirshberg will correct me on that if it's wrong. As well as being an expert on Israeli music, perhaps lesser known to some of us, that Professor Hirshberg is an expert on a very broad range of music, medieval music, late Baroque concertos, and particularly romantic Italian opera, about which he's written 2 books recently. In 2017, a book on opera in search of a just ruler for unified Italy. And just a couple of years ago, in 2019, Tragedy and Lieto Fine in Romantic Opera Seria, both of them published by the Luigi Boccarini Institute and Brepols Publishers. So we're going to be soon listening to Professor Hirshberg. And I'm wondering if I should, at this point, introduce Michael Wolpe, who's going to be coming very soon. He's the foremost composer in Israel, an educator, artistic director of many festivals, and as well as a scholar, and a member of Kibbutz Sde Boker, where he regularly organizes music festivals that have become legendary. He studied at Cambridge University for his MA and gained a PhD at the Hebrew University on the topic of the symphony in the 20th century, which will be his focus in discussing Tal. He's won many awards himself as a composer, the Prime Minister's Prize twice, and various awards such as the Acom Prize for Life Achievement, the Rosenboom Prize for Israeli Music, and the Yitzhak Navon Prize for Jewish music. And just recently, Michael Wolpe has been doing a remarkable project, which many of you might have seen, which is via Facebook and on YouTube, to cover the entire history of Israeli song in sort of bite-size presentations on the key people involved. And it's a really great series. So really looking forward to hearing from Michael Wolpe. So now I just want to, for the sake of disclosure, say that Joseph Tal is actually one of my personal heroes in Israeli music. We actually had a chance on COZ to discuss some of his music with Asaf Sheleg a few months ago, but not in too much breadth. So, and his very long life spanned the 20th century and beyond. So there's a lot to discuss. I won't go into the details, but to say that the JMI, and Geraldine will remember this, put on the UK premiere of one of Joseph Tal's operas. And I think the libretto was specially translated into English for the occasion. That was the Der Garten, about the Garden of Eden. And that was in 1998, I believe. In fact, I reviewed it, and I remember getting a letter from Joseph Tal sort of expressing pleasure would be the, maybe as not quite the right word, but sort of in reading a review. I think he said something nice about it. And then a couple of years later, I was very privileged to actually meet him and do an interview with him at his home. And I have to say that I was absolutely astonished, at this advanced age. His mind was absolutely razor sharp. Although his eyesight was failing, he was absolutely wonderful to meet and inspiring. I then studied some of his piano works and was fortunate to be able to lecture and do some lecture recitals about them and publish in UK music magazines all about them. So I'm very much excited to hear all about Joseph Tal, and I hope everybody will also save up some questions. We'll put them in the chat box and we'll deal with them at the end of the session. So over to you, Jehoash, and that's the end of me for the moment.
Is it okay now?
Yes, perfect.
You hear me now?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm not very fluent with the Zoom process, not very much in favor of it, but it makes it possible for me to talk to you all over the globe. That's the advantage. So this marks the day or the days when I moved the manuscript of the book to the Carmel edition in Jerusalem, which published my previous monographs. And now we start a long process of editing and typesetting. But the book, which is in Hebrew for the time being, will be published in the second half of the year 2022. But this will be the opportunity to mention him. You see his portrait. Tal had very long life. He was born in 1910 and he died in 2008. Just we were expecting to celebrate his 100th birthday, but we missed it by 2 years only. And I knew him well because he was my colleague at the musicology department, which he founded together with Alexander Ringer at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I had the privilege to see him almost on a daily basis and enjoy his great personality. And here is many premieres. He was very, very prolific. And therefore, it was a book which took a lot of work. And I was happy I could share it with several excellent colleagues who each of them contributed one chapter. And today we'll hear Michael, the great composer Michael Wolpe, talking about Tal's symphonies. And the second session next week, we'll hear Josef Goldenberg, who will talk about the double concerto for violin and cello, which is one of Tal's most complicated compositions. Shoshana Ze'evi will talk about one of his great songs, and Liran Gurkevich will talk about his pioneer work in electronic music. So just to mention the beginning, I want to mention, here you see the date, and here you see the Joseph Tal org is the site which his son Eitan built, an excellent internet site which has all his music, the scores, the manuscripts, and especially all his recordings, which means that when the book comes out, anyone who reads the book will be able to listen to the music and hear entire piece and not just a short example. Now, this will be my 5th monograph. Now we will just see briefly my early monograph on Ben Chaim, who had 2 publishings, my book on Boscovich with Professor Shmueli, my article on Stefan Wolpe in Israel, actually Palestine, my book on Yechezkel Brown published a few years ago, and the last one with Rakevet Barsadeh on Tzvi Avni, his life and works. Now, Tal was born in Poland, but his family moved to Berlin when he was still a baby. So actually all his life, early life, he grew up in the German culture with which he continued to live all his life. Now, a quote from Tal's book in Hebrew about his life. He wrote, in Hindemith's composition class, I was notified in 1927 that the tonal period was over. Lacking a positive name, the new period had to live with a negative term, atonal music. And Tal was one of the first who wrote what we used to call atonal music. I think it was a terrible term, but that's what we have. Now, when he came in 1934, he lived for 7 years in the Musikhochschule in Berlin, where he was Hindemith's student, among other great teachers. And there he said, I became, atonal music became my natural language, and Schoenberg's 12-note tone composition, although I did not cling to it, gave me realization of the unifying power of thematic material. And that's very important to remember that Tal was not a dodecaphonic composer at all. For him, it was a tool helping him in composition, but also my colleague Michael Wolpe will soon say the same, that if you start to analyze Tal by dodecaphonic technique, it will be very tiring and annoying work, and I suggest you don't do it, because you start and then the series disappears. It was a tool for himself, and that's all. Joseph Tal immigrated to Palestine, among the first musicians who created what was called later Israeli music. For the time, this was 1934, and Israel did not exist yet, and he was very young. He was only 24. Unlike Paul Ben Chaim, or Paul Frankenburger, who came to Palestine at the age of 36 as a very accomplished composer. For Tal, this was the beginning of his life as a composer. And about Palestine, you might have heard the bad term Mediterranean music, or even worse, the Mediterranean school. For first of all, there was no Mediterranean school, that's a wrong term. The Mediterranean music was invented by Mark Lavery, another important early Israeli composer, but he was completely opposite of Tal in his popular light music, which was very successful, and Tal opposed his writing altogether, and he wrote about the theories of Mediterranean music, that they were a distorted interpretation. Soon I was known as a hopeless enfant terrible. And Tal became known as an avant-gardist composer, but he was not avant-gardist as completely. He was very close to the traditional music, even tonal music, and he did not belong to any avant-gardist school. And now, since we don't have much time, I want to move to his most important genre of composition, which is his operas. Here I have the list of his operas. As you can see, 11 operas and short stage works. And he considered operas his most important genre, which he cultivated from a young age. His first short opera, Saul in Ein Dor, Shaul Be'Ein Dor, was written in 1955, and his last opera in Josef in 1995. Now I marked especially the language of each opera, and you will see soon that the number of German operas outnumbers that of Hebrew operas. 5 Hebrew operas, 6 German. Moreover, all the German operas were full length, where the Hebrew operas, 2 of them were one-act opera, Shaul in Ein Dor and Amnon and Tamar, the first. operas. And I would like to illustrate his typical musical language, which is totally German. Tal stayed with German all his life. His wife was German. They spoke only German at home. And he spoke German with his colleagues. All the Israeli composers were fluent in German. And he lived with the German culture. And now I will play a short section from a short stage work, The Hand, The Hand. The libretto was written by Israel Eliraz, his regular Israeli librettist, but was translated immediately into German and so far performed only in German. So I would ask Lori to help me with the technical procedure of moving to the opera performed by the Reutlinger Opera. Here you see two women. One of them reads the fate of the other on her hand, and then she realizes that she's actually reading her own terrible fate. It's pretty much a Kafka-like libretto.
Okay, Malcolm, are you going to be sharing this recording? Should I cancel this screen share now? Malcolm?
Lori is doing it, knows how to move.
No, this is
Yes,
Lori.
yes. I
Okay,
will.
so I'm going
I
to
will.
stop his sharing now.
I'm just gonna. I have to just find it very quickly. Yeah. I'm gonna share this now.
All right, you
1
are
second.
ready to go.
Hold on. I just have to find it. Share screen. Optimize. Share. Is that visible?
Yes.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
that one, yes.
How's
Right,
that? Even better?
yes, let's start
Okay.
now.
From the beginning. Okay, here we go.
Can we get rid of this?
Is that all right?
Yes.
Good enough.
Sie weiß nicht mehr, wann sich ihr die Hand entgegenstreckte, die sie nun seit langem hüllt. Die zarten Finger spreizen sich nach außen. Sie wollen immer weiter wachsen, einen verlorenen Erdteil zeichnen. Lauschend folgt sie den Linien der Karte und fürchtet schon die Schönheit ihrer jungen Fläche zu verlieren. Die Violinform, die in ihrer Hand ist noch kaum geprägt. Im Zwielicht der Stille sagt sie: Ich sehe einen Mann, mit dem du Liebe teilen willst. Was schön war, wird hässlich werden. Ich sehe etwas, das bereits entschieden ist. Jemand wird verletzt.
Okay, we'll stop here.
Sehr viel später.
Lori, let's stop this one. And we'll stay there for the second example, which will come at the end. Right now, first of all, I wanted just to mention Tal's reaction to the newspaper reviews he was getting. He wrote that one newspaper wrote about him that this music could have been written anywhere in the world. And the other one wrote, yes, this is the Israeli music. They say, since they neutralized one another, I could go on writing peacefully. And he didn't care about the music reviews anymore. And now I would like to invite Michael Wolpe to speak about Tal's 6 symphonies. One of after the operas, his most important part of composition. Michael, please.
Thank you very much, Joash. And thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm very happy to see a lovely close friend, Jaladin, other people.
We don't see it.
No, you see me in another. I have 2 plates, Malcolm. One is just for sharing all kind of papers, and the other is in which you can see, you can watch. Okay.
Laurie, can you get Professor Wolpe?
If you can help me. If you
Sorry,
can assist me.
What seems to be the issue?
Malcolm, if you can help me in
Laurie, can we pin Michael? He's got 2 screens, so maybe you can just
I have 2 screens. One is for sharing.
Oh, okay. It's okay now.
You could.
Okay, so I will try now to share something. If you can
Oh, now we see you.
I'm sure I have pinned both Michael Wolpe's now.
Okay, thank you.
That should work. Thank you.
Have you made him a co-host so that he can share?
There should be no problem with him sharing.
I cannot share still.
Oh, here it is. We see him now.
No.
Keep it on.
Well, I will make you a co-host.
If you can help me in the black one, the one without the video. This is the
Okay,
one.
you are now a co-host as well, so it shouldn't be a problem to share.
Fantastic. Yes, now we are ready. I hope that everybody can see now.
Yes, it's okay now.
Okay. Very
Yes,
good.
perfect.
Just a second. Fantastic. So just a second. Okay. So now we can move on. Now I would like to show you first of all this first example, which represents the 6 symphonies that Joseph Tal had composed in between 52 to 91. Each of the symphony was actually a commission. The first, the second, the third, and the fourth were actually commissioned by the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra for all kind of occasions. The fifth was commissioned by the Berlin Philharmonic and Daniel Barenboim. it was a very special and touching event for Daniel Boehm, who really admired Joseph Tal and had the honor to commission this symphony, which is supposed to be the most complicated and interesting from all the six. I can tell you from the composer himself that he found his Fifth Symphony as a kind of a summary or synthesis of all the techniques of the other four symphonies, and the sixth, which was written in the same year of the fifth, which is a miracle for itself because he was already quite old, in his 80s, is the Sixth Symphony, which was commissioned by a festival in Germany. The First Symphony is a tonal piece, which actually was born from a very interesting and, I would say, individual dialogue in between the composer and the tonal school in Israel. Especially, I think that he thought that he has to give a kind of answer to the main Mediterranean rational style that was still quite dominant, represented by the composers of his generation and even few of his pupils. The Second Symphony was the first dodecaphonic piece that Joseph Tal wrote, but as I will show afterwards, it is not exactly a dodecaphonic piece. The third and the fourth were written in the set technique, which was a kind of a free technique built on the set theory, which was quite fashionable and popular in between contemporary composers in the 70s and the 80s. And the fifth and the sixth, as I wrote here, are kind of a synthesis in between the three techniques. I would say that for myself, I really found each of these symphonies very interesting. And above all, I would say that what is very interesting is that Joseph Tal had decided to give the title symphony to pieces which are in between 12 minutes to 21 minutes, which means that these are actually quite short orchestral pieces, all of them in one movement played. And then comes the question, why did Joseph Tal give the title symphony to each of these pieces, and why he did not give the title symphony to other orchestral pieces that he wrote? I had a few very interesting conversations with Joseph Tal about it, and his answer was that today the mission of the composer is to write a symphony which will be, on one hand, a real symphony, very impressive, monumental, touching, communicative enough that 1,000 people in the hall will be really moved by the music. But it has to be short, because the audience today cannot anymore listen to a piece of 1.5 hours like it was in the Romantic era. So he thought that his challenge is to write something that will be a symphony, but of a 12 minutes, of 16 minutes, and not more. Another answer, which I heard from him twice at least, was that with his own technique, which are quite complicated, the measure of time that he needs to express himself, the measure of time that he needs to come to the climax of the piece is really short. He doesn't need what is needed in a Brahms or in a Malayan symphony. He doesn't need the 2 or 3 or 4 themes. He doesn't need the modulation in the development. All this is not really important. What is important is to give the impression of a symphony in a couple of minutes. So after saying that, I would like to go on with a little bit of music. So I will change now. Just a second. And we shall start immediately with the First Symphony, the symphony that was written in 52, and it is quite amazing to listen to this piece, which is actually almost, I would say, a neo-romantic piece, not very usual for Joseph Tal, especially because he used two very lovely themes, which I will try to share with you now. So let us try. Tell me if you can listen to the music. Now let us try something from the very end of the piece. Okay, this is just to get the impression of the Joseph Tal, very expressive, I would say almost romantic style. And now I want to show you a few examples that I have arranged for my lecture. Here it comes. So this is the first symphony, main melody. This melody comes from a Piyutim collection by that was edited by Avraham Tzvi Idelson, one of the greatest musicologists of Israeli music. Joseph Tal took this melody. It was quite a thing to find the melody in the book, because Joseph Tal is writing in the concert premiere program that this melody is based on a piyut to the words on the river of Babylon. But actually, when I found the melody, it is a melody which is dedicated to absolutely a different text. I don't know why Joseph Tal is declaring that this is the text, but I assume it has something to do with the dance that he wrote music for, which had this title somewhere in the beginning of in the end of the 40s. Anyway, you can see that the way that the melody is written is very modal, and actually, this melody is represented by Joseph Tal in the second movement, or I would say in the second half of the first symphony. The other important motif that he's using is a kind of a mode which is, you can see that in this mode you have the E flat with the F sharp and then the B flat with the C sharp. He represents this mode in few places in the symphony, and always from this mode he built this kind of chord, which includes actually all the notes of the mode as a harmony, as a chord. And it has a very special sound, especially when it is orchestrated in all kind of fantastic effects, especially in the strings, in the high woodwinds, a kind of a Mahlerian atmosphere. Another motif, which is very important too in the piece, and we could listen to by the viola in the beginning of the symphony, is this lamento motif. In the very end of the symphony, use all the motifs together. And this was the place that I have that we have listened together in the end of my demonstration for this symphony. What is even more important and a kind of a very unique example from the symphony is when he takes the same melody from the Idelson book and change few intervals and change the tempi to get this beautiful melody. La la si, la la sol fa la si, do re fa do la si, etc., which is, I think, very similar to Mark Lavery and other composers who were part of the Mediterranean school. I didn't mention Ben Chaim. I mentioned Jacobi and Lavery, as I think are much more similar in the style, the melodic style, to this melody, which ends the symphony. The symphony was a great, had a great success in the premiere in Israel in 52, 53. And what is important to say that all the people who wrote about it, and there were many of them, critics and listeners, all of them had somehow concerned the title On the River of Babylon's a very important principal way to understand this symphony as a Jewish symphony that speaks about the suffering that was actually 10 years ago, and about the relief, and I would say almost a renaissance of the Jewish music as they understood this symphony. When I talked to Joseph Tal about it, he didn't say something particular, but he told me that actually this was the main impression of the listeners, and he can take it as a compliment. This was the way he thought the people could understand the title. Anyway, in 1960, Joseph Tal wrote his second symphony, and the second symphony I will show you is based on two tone sets. One of them is a 12-tone row, and the other one is a rhythmic set or rhythmic row, as you can see here. Joseph Tal himself wrote about it a very short article, but after reading this article, something like 25 years ago, I went to Joseph Tal and we were sitting together reading the score, and I asked him if he can explain me how he is using this tone set actually in his symphony. And his response was, I don't remember what I did when I composed the piece, and I have no idea where you can find the notes of the row, if you can find it at all, because actually after a few bars of my composition, I didn't need the row anymore. I just wrote everything in a kind of one inspirative moment, and he told me that he composed this symphony in few days, in a couple of days, which we can already see in the very beginning of the piece. If you see here, you can see the notes of the row, but you can see that he is repeating the notes, and absolutely not like in the Schoenbergian method. It is not a real dodecaphonic technique. He used actually the row to build a kind of a C minor chord in the beginning of the symphony, and actually not just it is not an it's not an atonal Schoenbergian symphony. Actually, it is a tonal piece in C minor, as you can, I think, find very convincing C minor in the beginning of the symphony. Let us experience the beginning of it. I'm sorry. Just a second. Here it is.
אומנות הפילוסופיה של ברוס לי, אחות
Okay, now I want to show you again the examples from the symphony. You can see the very how what we have just listened to in the beginning of symphony is build a C and then an E flat together with D, of course, and then you have here a B flat, and all this give you the impression of a kind of a C minor chord, which is represented actually in the first 3 minutes of the symphony. Now, if we shall go to the third symphony, and this will be the very end of my short lecture, here you have a kind of a set which is not a dodecaphonic set, not a 12 notes row, 12 note row like in the dodecaphonic technique, but a new set theory which can give is built on kind of a set of intervals, actually, like here, do, re, si, do, again, re, like here, goes to the C sharp that we had here, etc. I will not go on, but you can see this is the first row on which is built all the first, I would say, 5-6 minutes of his third symphony. And afterward, he's changing it to another row. This is the second row of the symphony, which is actually organizing all the second half of this third symphony, which is the most complicated and most, I would say, avant-garde piece that Joseph Tal composed. I don't have time to speak about all the symphonies. I would like to end now and to come to a conclusion. I would recommend you all to sit and to listen to all the 6 symphonies. Each of them is really short. You need few minutes to sit down and just listen to the very beautiful 6 pieces, which are really different one from the other. The third one is, I would say, the most tragic one. It was written in a very special year, the year 78, which was a year that, as I understood from Joseph Tal, was for him very crucial, because on one hand, we were after 2 wars, and in one of the wars, Joseph Tal had lost his son, his beloved first son, who was unfortunately died in the 6 Days War. And in 78, it was the beginning of the peace negotiation between Egypt and Israel, which was had a very deep meaning for Joseph Tal. And all those things, as he told me, were part of the adventures that he wanted to share with us in this symphony. And if you will listen to the third symphony, you can see these ups and downs of characters and expression. The fourth symphony, on the other hand, is maybe the most joyful and I would say very impressive and communicative piece. It was written for the Philharmonic Orchestra to its 50th anniversary, and it is a lovely piece. The fifth symphony, which was written for Daniel Barenboim and the Berlin Orchestra, is a very interesting piece because it actually summarizes a lot of melodies, a lot of motifs that we have heard already in the first 4 symphonies. As I understand from Joseph Tal, he meant to summarize with this symphony all his symphony project. But then after finishing the 5th symphony, very surprisingly, he got another commission. And he sat down and he wrote his 6th symphony. For me, the 6th symphony is the most beautiful of all, because it was written without any tense to express something particular or to make any impression on this audience or on this audience. On the contrary, it was written for a small festival in Germany, and I think that from all the symphonies, the 6th one is the most sincere and touching piece. So I recommend you all take 2-3 hours, sit down and listen to this beautiful music. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm wondering if Jehoash would like to come back at this point, because eventually we're going to open it up, and I hope you'll stay there, that the audience, that people here can ask questions and we can have a discussion.
Yeah, so I would like to come in if you can put me on. I don't know what I have to do for that.
You're on now.
Yeah, do you hear me now?
Yes, very clear.
Yes, I don't know what, I just need a few minutes now, since it's already 8. And I would like to move to another important part of Tal's music, which is the music for piano. Piano music, and the chapter on piano music is written by Ofra Itzhaki, one of the most wonderful pianists in Israel, a young pianist who played most of Tal's music, maybe all of it. And she's a great performer dedicated to Israeli music. And I would like to, she could not come in and talk about the music, but I would like you to see her and hear her playing. And this is one of his last pieces for piano. He wrote 5 compositions, each of which called the essay, from 1 to 5. And now Tal was a truly great pianist, a very virtuoso. I remember his playing, and I was always surprised by the extreme how quickly he could play. He was a short man. His hands were small, and still he could play extremely quickly. And anyone who wants to play his music has to play the music of a virtuoso pianist, and that's what Ofra is doing. And I will play to you the entire essay number 5, which is very short, only 4 minutes and 4.5 minutes, and you will see his aggressive, dramatic style, which was very typical of Tal. So, Laurie, could you please move to the last example?
Malcolm, I believe you're coordinating that one.
Yes, I'm just about to share it. And if Jehoash, do you want to play the whole example? You're right. Okay.
Yeah, it's very short.
It's short. Okay, here we go. I think this should work.
Here she is. That's 20 years ago.
So this is essay number 5. Sorry.
Thank you. So we will finish now and continue next week with our three authors, Shoshana Ze'evi, Yossi Goldenberg, and Liran Gurkevich, who will talk about the electronic music. Tal was the pioneer of electronic music in Israel, and we will hear some of his compositions. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I will be happy, of course, to answer.
Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Hirshberg, and thank you once again to Professor Wolpe for a wonderful presentation this afternoon with some beautiful extracts and examples of Joseph Tal's music. Now, I know we have actually a little bit of time, and we have a lot of very interesting people here, and I'm sure that you all have some questions. And I mean, what we usually do is either sort of use raise hands through the reactions button, or raise hands really, or actually write in the chat box, whatever you prefer. And you can address the questions to either of the speakers or to anyone else. If anyone's got an immediate question, I can see, is it Benjamin Meisner? Yeah. Would you, you're the first there, so well done.
I'm the first because I think I know Jehoash Hirshberg from my youth. Jehoash, did you, ניגנת בתזמורת הגדנ"ע? Did you play in the Gadna Symphony Orchestra?
Yes, very for a short time only.
I know. Okay, no, that's not what I'm asking. I'm familiar with a lot of these composers because I'm a conductor, and I conducted a lot of choral music of Tzvi Avni and Ben Chaim and Mark Lavry, and I have a whole recital of Israeli art songs which I've done over the years. But you didn't mention Ami Ma'ayani. Is he one of these in the same genre of Joseph Tal and everything? Because I remember he was conducting the Gadna Symphony Orchestra when I was 13 and 14.
Yeah, well, Ami Ma'ayani was, of course, much younger. He's slightly older than me. That's all. And Tal was born in 1910. We are talking about another generation, of course.
No, because I used to buy all the publication of the IMP and IMI. I just retired, and I'm in the process of donating my library to Gila Flam in the Israel National Music Library. But I've heard about you, and I've read your books, and I know I followed your career quite closely.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I mean, otherwise I might just chip in myself just to start, if I'm using chair privilege. Oh, there we got Ronit. I think Ronit actually will, she trumps me there. So Ronit, if you unmute, you have to unmute, please.
Yeah. Well, wonderful to see you again after so long. And thank you so much, Michael and Jehoash, and for all of this presentation. That was really fascinating. I've learned a lot. I wrote about Joseph Tal in the Musical Quarterly a few years ago. And one idea that I talked about actually resonates in what you, Jehoash, say today. And it was brilliant, I thought, to begin your presentation with his most important genre, his operas, and to make a point that just approximately half of the operas were written in German. And you talked a lot about his German identity, and you raised that idea that I heard it a few times ago, that you said, okay, one critic wrote that this is absolutely Israeli, the other said it could have been written anywhere in the world. I can keep going on with my own style. But between the lines of many things that you've been written, Jehoash, about Tal, you actually do reach that conclusion that his style was German, and you made a point of it. And I wonder, what can you elaborate on that identity marker, and how is his German identity come through in his music itself?
Oh yes, my claim is that Tal was basically a German composer. He himself wrote, I didn't have the time to quote all his many, he was very articulate about his writing. And he wrote that the fact that he moved to Palestine did not mean his style changed overnight. He could not change it immediately, did not mean to change it. But Ben Chaim meant to change his style, although he kept much of his style as it was. But with Ben Chaim, it was much more complicated. But Tal virtually stayed a German composer. He tried to quote some traditional tunes here and there, but altogether his world, even his daily world, was German. And this you hear in his music, definitely.
Yeah, and actually his peers at that time, especially what was called at the time the Troika, Bartosz, Boscovich, and Setter, they felt it, and maybe his reception was marred by that thing. Well, he cannot become an Israeli composer. He cannot actually represent Israeli culture as Israeli. And this is why he was, for some composers, he was a little bit marginalized because of that. He was a wonderful composer, but he was marginalized because he was seen as not able enough to show, at least in the oppressive time of the 50s and 60s, well, you're not able enough to show us how Israeli you are, therefore maybe your music is not that great. And he was a wonderful composer. He wrote great pieces, I think. Yeah, but I think he was, yeah.
He was very much admired, especially he benefited from the fact that he was the composer at the Hebrew University. He was the great professor at the Hebrew University, and he didn't have to compete with the composers of the Tel Aviv Academy.
Yeah.
And actually the Tel Aviv Academy was very difficult. They also rejected Ben Chaim, and there was no reason to do it. But let's not speak about the personal aspect.
Yeah.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you very much for bringing that really important point out, which I'm sure one can actually end up debating all evening about the identity issue. But I just sort of, it reminds me of part of actually when I did this interview, he said, I think, which he said many times about something. I've got a quote here, that it's not, the identity is not defined through the outside, but internally. And he said to me, it will take 50 or 100 years for critics to gain a perspective on what's going on here. So he had a sort of an idea that of Israeli style, but that it wasn't defined, and that no, you know, it wasn't a simple, you know, markers using themes and whatever. Which anyway, we can discuss that later. So I can see there's another hand going up, Agnes. And if you'd like to, if anyone else wants to ask, so I can also see Shoshana Zevi, is that right? And Michael wants to respond as well. Okay, I mean, what I want to say is that, I mean, the discussion can go on a long time on this topic. So let's try and limit it a bit so that we can sort of do different topics, you know what I mean? Michael, do you want to? So Shoshana Zevi is trying to speak.
Oh, sorry.
Shall we let her speak first, Mika?
No problem.
If you unmute, you have to how do you say that in Hebrew? To unmute.
I don't know, unmute.
Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
It is just a few words. If you take two operas, one show in Endor and Ashmedai, it's completely Israeli operas. Even Ashmedai, it's in German, because Ashmedai is a critical and of what's happening in Germany. And if you look at Joseph Tal as a composer that is taking and molding two cultures and in his personality, and of course, as a Jew in Israel, is expecting and his perspective, the ideas of German now in modern German, and Shaul and Endor, which is the first opera, is absolutely Jewish. Absolutely, it's not German at all. Even he wrote in German. I'll talk about it next week when I'm giving his my last piano.
It was a great appetizer. Thank you very much for that's a sort of attraction for everyone to come next week, please. And we're going to carry on this discussion. So, Michael, did you want to come in?
Yes, I want to say that the way that Joseph Tal is using the set theory technique and the dodecaphonic technique is absolutely individual and is absolutely not German, because he's so free in the way he uses the techniques. And I heard from him twice when he came back from conferences in Germany, how the German composers were criticize him about being not didactic and somehow doesn't have any respect to the Stockhausian attitude to those techniques. And I would say that Joseph Tal is absolutely Joseph Tal. And all this question about what he is and from what location, I think is almost not relevant when we speak about him. And actually, listening especially with the third and the fourth symphony, I thought about Maxwell Davis and Bert Whistle much more than any German composers from his generation, one generation after. So I would say that actually this kind of freedom of using the technique is much similar to the British attitude and not to the German attitude. And about the German language, it is absolutely connected to the German commissions. I mean, if an English opera house would commission a piece, or I don't know, French, maybe you would write in French. I don't think that this is the issue. And I have to say that in every conversation with Joseph, always, he was so much involved in what is going in Israel, and especially the death of his first beloved boy in the war was a crucial event in his life, which connected him to Israel 100%. And I think it's very important to put this issue, to put it on the table and say that I think that he was not a German composer. It is not. It's not the way to describe it.
I think we could probably come back to this. Yeah, we might come back to this when we look at all the different works, and that sort of it might arise as a topic. Is Jehoash, can we allow Agnes to say we have somebody's hand up here?
Yeah.
Shall we? Another question? Is it a question rather than a comment? Agnes?
Yes.
Thanks, thank you.
Well, in fact, can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, Ronit answered my question almost. And Malcolm, you hinted that you didn't want this kind of topic, but I still want to ask, what was the reception, the official reception of the German language operas? Because it was quite soon after the Holocaust, just 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. And a lot of people in Israel might have been a little bit sensitive about it. So I would like to know what the official reception was.
there was no reception at all because they were not performed at all in Israel. The operas were commissioned by the German operas in Munich, in Berlin, and they performed there. They were not yet performed in Israel. In Israel, we heard the Hebrew operas, Josef and the short operas, and there was no problem about it. But he was not criticized for writing in German. This was sort of accepted. I think people did not care very much about it, but they are not known. They were not performed. That's a shame, but they haven't been performed yet. They are extremely complicated. What I wanted to mention, and I didn't have the time to get to it, that the German operas belong to the genre of didactic operas. And they deal with theoretical aesthetic problems, quite complicated. They are not emotional operas. They are what is called didactic, like Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill belong there. And that reason they are quite complicated. And we still have to come to them. And they're extremely complicated, difficult with many participants. A performance will be extremely expensive, and I don't expect it to come very soon. That's a problem.
Thank you.
Does anybody else would like to chip in? Actually, I was just I know since we're gonna be talking about operas and things, I'm sure this topic will come up again. So we have a week to think about it. And plus, I just want to reiterate what Jehoash said at the beginning about the wonderful website, that it would be wonderful this week if everyone sort of managed to do like their 5 vegetables a day, managed to listen to some 5 Joseph Tal pieces a day or something, so that we all are sort of fresh in our ears and we can have a good discussion about the pieces for next week. Anyway, that's just a quick comment. I'm sure there must be some other questions. Actually, I had a little question for Michael, which I just throw in. In the first symphony, Michael, there's a wonderful, which is a sort of a solo. I think it's bass clarinet. I'm not sure if that's the one that first introduces this theme that is from Edelson's collection, and then it's taken over by the bassoon. And I'm just thinking about the use of the orchestra, just as a general thing. In what sense, Tal developed as an orchestrator through his symphonies? Can you see a sort of a sea change, like at a certain point, maybe when he gets to the 5th symphony or something? I mean, he's using it quite classically at the beginning with different sections, and even though it is this atonal, or it's not quite atonal in the first piece, but he then moves to a more complicated, let's say, texture. How is his attitude to the orchestra sort of evolving, do you think?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that Joseph Tal orchestration is absolutely traditional and conservative. Basically, he's orchestrating his ideas like any romantic composer. From this point of view, too, he is absolutely not a part of the contemporary avant-garde, not at all. He is always a melodist, even in the 3rd symphony. The way he is using the row is melodic. Kind of a recitative, a long recitative, and each instrument gets a very long solo, not just in the 1st symphony, but in all the 3. And basically, I think that he's using each group of the orchestra as a whole sound and color group. Strings, woodwind, brass. He doesn't mix a lot in between the groups. And basically, if you look on each score from quite far away without to think about the notes, just about the texture, you get a kind of a Beethovenian orchestration.
I mean, there's a lot of ostinati and little, I mean, what we discussed actually with Asaf Sheleg in terms of the sort, but it wasn't a symphony, this cellular type of textures built up of these little sort of motivic cells, which then generate textures and occasionally.
This technique has to do a lot with the Ta'amei Mikra and with the declamation, the Jewish declamation. You take, for example, 5 notes, and he's using them again and again, but as the rhythm is changing, each note will fall differently in the pattern, in the rhythmic pattern. So you had, for example, you have a rhythmic, like in the Middle Ages, you have a Talea and Color, basically, that is what.
Right.
But it has nothing to do with, maybe a little bit influenced by Ligeti. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think it is his own way of doing it.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm just aware that we've hit the 90 minutes, but we might have some more comments or questions. I don't know. I can see here Rotem is here, another composer. We have some good musicologists amongst us here. Might have some comments to make or questions. I'm wondering about actually just a very, very big topic, which is you mentioned right at the beginning, Jehoash, about reception, and of course reception depends on exposure and being able to hear the music, and things like publication and performers. Is there enough performance going on in your view of Joseph Tal's music? Is there are there what sort of editions are out there? You know, is Joseph Tal's music sort of as much of a repertoire, presence as you would like it to be, and in order to, I mean, I noticed that there are multiple recordings of many of the works, which is wonderful, that one can compare.
Yes, he has been much recorded. And well, we know about what is called modern music. It cannot be performed a lot, but he is performed, especially the chamber music is performed a lot. With the symphonic music, it depends on conductors, whether they choose to conduct his symphonies or other. He has many symphonic works which are not symphonies and are excellent. But my hope is that the book will help listeners to maneuver in his huge repertoire, to know what is there, what is available. That's a problem. But
and of course to understand and to be able to interpret it with some degree of knowledge and understanding of the techniques that he's using, which is going to be fantastic. And I'm sure the book is going to be a really, really valuable contribution. I wonder,
if I can add one sentence.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I think it's important to say that now, after 3 months listening again and again to Joseph Tal, orchestral music and operas, writing this essay that I wrote about his symphonies, what was for me so surprising is that actually Joseph Tal, Mordechai Setter, Eden Partosh, Paul Ben Chaim, Mark Lavry, etc., all the Israeli first generation of composers are not very far away in style, as I thought before. There are a lot of similarities, especially from the melodic tension and this kind of neo-romanticism, which is not, I don't speak about the tonal or atonal issue, more about the rhetoric expression. Joseph Tal is not so far away from Paul Ben Chaim. In the end, there is something very similar in the expression and in the energetic tense of these two composers. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It ties up. I once had a very interesting meeting with Shulamit Ran, who had a sort of similar point to make, that it's sort of in hindsight, you know, looking back, that actually Ben Chaim and Tal were not the sort of opposite poles that they appeared at the time. But and I didn't go into more detail of that. What I'd like to do is anyway then to again thank everybody, all our speakers. Oh, Agnes is. Did you want to speak, Agnes?
Yeah.
Okay, Agnes is going to give us another question. Thank you.
No, it's just a comment, and it's very, very, very short, and it may be a coincidence or not, but I just decided to tell you that that mode which Professor Wolpe showed in connection with one of the piano pieces, I hope I'm not confused. I think it was in connection with one of the piano pieces. That mode which goes la 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 la. That mode, it just so happens that it's also known in some parts of the world as the Hungarian gypsy mode, one of the two Hungarian gypsy modes. So I was delighted to see this mode on the screen, and I was delighted to hear the Joseph Tal composed in this mode, and I just wanted to tell you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Agnes. And if I may say thank you to Malcolm. Malcolm, our scholar, our musicologist, our writer, critic, and somebody who's always been passionate about music from Israel. Has written about it, has run conferences about it, and it's a real pleasure for us to be welcoming Israeli composers on the screen today. Michael Wolpe, it's so lovely to see you. Michael was one of our visiting composers from Israel when Malcolm was the head of the JMI Forum for Israeli Music. We had this wonderful scheme of inviting a visiting composer from Israel. And it was really a pleasure to have Michael come over for various periods and pop into the Royal Academy or the Royal College or Kiel University or Cambridge or wherever it was that we went, and we had a wonderful time. And it would be lovely to actually set up that scheme again. It really, I think, opened many doors and was very special. So we look forward again to next week. Jehoash, who's been a keynote speaker at our conferences, and really to continue this conversation about the music of Israel, which is so important, and one doesn't get to hear it that often. So, so here Malcolm has put the website josephtal.org to listen to the work. So let's have a feast of Joseph Tal in the meantime, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.